Time for a little haunted religion. From director Paul Schrader, I think it's one of the best movies of the last decade. It's a starkly beautiful yet very heavy movie. First Reformed, coming up next. First Reformed is a 2018 movie from writer-director Paul Schrader. You know Schrader's work from early collaborations with Martin Scorsese. For example, he wrote the screenplay to the movie Taxi Driver. But he's been a long-time director, and he might have made his masterpiece in First Reformed. The movie takes place in upstate New York, just outside of Albany, and there's a Reformed church, part of the Protestant Christian tradition, which has a pastor in it. The pastor's name, played by Ethan Hawke, does a fabulous job here, is Ernst Toller. Toller's a pastor of a church that has only about 10 members attending. You see interior shots of the church during his sermon, and there's hardly anybody there. So the movie introduces you to the idea that religion for this particular man in this place is fairly empty. But the church is owned and run, I think, by what's called in America a megachurch, which is a church of several thousand people. And the pastor of this church is played wonderfully by Cedric the Entertainer. Now, Pastor Toller of the Reformed Church is not just a pastor, he's also a museum keeper and a tour guide. Because this church he's in has great historical interest. And it has a long history and tradition in that particular area. So much so that the church has tours and it sells souvenirs to the tourists. Now, the pastor is a single man. His wife is separated from him, and we come to learn that he has a haunting pain. His son was killed in the Iraq War in the early 2000s, and he blames himself for this because he told his son to go into the military. He's a man who on the outside wears the garb of a pastor, but on the inside, as we know from the voiceover narrator, he's in deep despair and is haunted by the fact that, well, maybe he doesn't believe in what he says. At the beginning of the movie, he writes a diary, and the voiceover provides us with the words from the diary. Now, he says that the diary is a form of prayer because he has a hard time praying, which is ironic because, of course, he's supposed to be a man of God. And so we're constantly looking at him as a public figure, as a man talking to people in private, and then him living by himself in his own private house writing in his diary. In other words, there's several different layers to this pastor, and part of the movie is he's trying to figure out who he is and what he even believes in, despite his position as a pastor in the Christian religion. At one point, he needs to counsel a man who's obsessed with environmentalism, and this young man is totally fearful of an environmental apocalypse. After meeting with this young man, the pastor goes to meet him again, but the young man has shot himself. The pastor finds the dead body, and unfortunately this young man who's committed suicide has a wife who is 5 months pregnant. In fact, part of this young man's suicide is that, well, he didn't want to have the baby, he wanted to abort it, because he didn't believe in bringing children into this world. A world going to hell thanks to global warming and other environmental problems. Pastor Toller is confronted with the fact that the man he counseled actually ended up killing himself. Also, this man's wife finds in a shed that he had a bomb ready to strap himself to. He was going to become an eco-terrorist, but instead he killed himself. Well, the pastor doesn't tell the police about this and instead takes the man's laptop, his writings, and the bombs back to his house. And slowly over the course of the movie, we see Pastor Toller disintegrate. First, his health gets worse and worse, and he seems to become an alcoholic over the course of the movie. Second, he himself becomes obsessed with environmental apocalypticism, and he starts to believe the whole world's going to hell. So then the question is, what is he going to do with the bombs that this young man made? As all this is happening, he and the pastor of the megachurch are preparing for his church's 250th anniversary reconsecration. It's going to be a big public event with lots of suits and lots of celebration.
A mighty fortress is our God. That's all Oregon. Did you know that Martin Luther wrote that in that outhouse?
Yeah.
Mighty fortress.
But how is this Pastor Toller going to get to the celebration when he himself is disintegrating, his health is falling apart, and he doesn't know what he believes in, and he's becoming more and more obsessed over environmentalism? The movie is really heavy on the subjects of hope and despair. Should we hope in a future for this world, a future for ourselves in the afterlife? Or should we despair about what the future will bring? Pastor says at one point, despair is the ultimate pride because it believes in the certainty of what will happen in the future, even though no human can be certain about what's going to happen.
I know that nothing can change, and I know there is no hope. Thomas Merton wrote this. Despair is a development of pride so great that it chooses one's certitude rather than admit God is more creative than we are.
So despair, at least for Christians, is a sin. It's the opposite of faith. But the pastor in this movie goes deeper and darker into a world of despair. Stylistically, the movie is really interesting. First of all, it has a 4:3 aspect ratio, which harkens back to older movies that have that same ratio. As well, it makes everything much tighter and more constrained, especially all the shots in this movie, all the static imagery. Second, part of this movie is nearly in black and white. It is a color movie, but so much of the cinematography, in particular that during the night scenes, looks black and white, or at least grayish. So you have this minister who's wearing a black robe during the day, but during his church services he wears a white robe. He's in his house huddled over a laptop worried about environmentalism at night, and it's very dark, versus being in the church during the day and it's very bright and white. Contrasts like this between black and white, hope and despair, show up in this movie all over the place. And of course the main contrast, or at least one of them, is between faith and doubt or despair. When this movie first came out and I saw the trailer, I was worried about it because I thought it was going to be an environmentalist movie. I thought it was going to be a message movie with an ideology behind it. We're subjected to so much of that these days. I was dismissive of this movie at first. But I've realized this, that although you could watch this movie as sort of promoting an environmentalist agenda, I find this movie is more about isolation and obsession. The pastor becomes so wrapped up in this obsession over environmentalism that he sends himself down the deep dark hole of despair. At the same time, he himself counsels people to have hope, to think about the future, to realize that other people in the past have been in dark despairing moments themselves. So I find this movie is more about the delusions the pastor is under, and you could put any topic in the place of environmentalism, and I think this movie would work. Because this movie is a 21st century, environmentalism is the main topic. But the director Paul Schrader is alluding to a lot of movies, including those from the late 20th century, where characters obsessed over nuclear war and the destruction of the world through nuclear war. One of the directors quoted here often in this movie is Andrei Tarkovsky. In fact, many of Tarkovsky's movies are quoted almost liberally. The black and white cinematography looks like Tarkovsky's movie Nostalgia. The dilemma of the character in this movie is like Tarkovsky's movie in The Sacrifice. There's even a levitation scene in this movie, and of course Tarkovsky in almost all of his movies use levitation scenes. First Reformed actually quotes dozens of movies. One of them, of course, and you'll see this on the internet, is Diary of the Country Priest. And the whole setup of this movie, where a pastor who's isolated in a community writes in his diary, is like Diary of a Country Priest. But I'm also telling you, Paul Schrader is alluding to himself and Martin Scorsese, because Taxi Driver from the 1970s has a very similar setup about a man who becomes obsessed with a social problem so much that he might be willing to destroy others and kill himself. Here in this movie, you have a very similar setup, updated for the 21st century. And I think First Reform, calling out to movie history, quoting so many movies, I think the subject matter that it's about, I think the way it's about that, make this, in fact, a totally great movie. Even though there are a few clunky dialogue scenes where things are announced via exposition that don't need to be, I find the way that this movie was shot, I think Ethan Hawke's performance in it, I think everybody's performance in it is very good. And so if you can stand the haunted atmosphere of this movie, the very weighty issues that it deals with, I think you'll really appreciate First Reformed, no matter what religion you are. If you've seen this movie, what do you think of it? Please leave us a comment and tell us what you think. Also, please subscribe to this channel to help support what we're doing. Thank you very much. Have a great day.